Namaskar and welcome to Sunset Television. I am Vishal Dahiya, and today in Perspective, we're going to talk about the 16th presidential election, the counting of votes. Three rounds have happened, and in those three rounds, Draupadi Murmu, the NDA's nominee for the presidential election, has secured more than 50% votes. That means that she will be the 15th president of India. Congratulatory messages have started pouring in from her opponent, that is the joint opposition candidate Yashwant Sinha, as well as the present President of India, Ram Nath Kovind, and the Prime Minister himself, including the Speaker of Lok Sabha also. So we'll today talk about, try and understand this, not only this entire process, but also the social and political implications as well of this presidential election. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with, we have with us in the studio Mr. K. Yatish Rajawat, senior journalist, who is joining us. Welcome, Mr. Rajawat, to Sunset TV studios. And we're also joined by Professor A.K. Verma. He is the director of Center for the Study of Society and Politics in Kanpur. Welcome to you as well, Professor Verma. I'll start with you, Mr. Rajawat, and let's take a, sort of an assessment here. Starting from the day when the nominations were filed, both by the NDA's nominee for the presidential election, that is Draupadi Murmu, who is now going to be the 15th president. That's pretty much clear. An official announcement is what is left. And the opposition candidate as well. From there till now, this entire process has, brought out various aspects vis-a-vis sections of the society, vis-a-vis aspirations of a particular section of the society, the choice of the candidate as well, and of course, the electoral battle between these two candidates, which ultimately is the essence of Indian democratic, system.
To put it into a context, Vishal, more than the political impact of this or the policy impact of this, the bigger impact, I think, of this election is the fact that, for first time, the largest democracy in the country has a tribal leader. And to describe the tribal leader, it's very, I used 4 or 5 words, of course, tribal, teacher, banker at one point in time, woman, widower, mother, and now the president of this country. So I think more than the political impact, there is the inspirational impact of this particular choice. And the inspirational impact, I think, would be far greater, not only within the tribal community itself, but I think in the mind of every little girl who is now looking at the, these images on television of this woman who has risen from a small village in Mahudbanj district, Udarbhan, and risen not just to another position, but risen consecutively and consistently through her life, from being a tribal to walking some 270 kilometers to get her degree, to becoming an official in the government, and then devoting her life to becoming a teacher, fighting elections, winning as an MLA, fighting elections, losing as an MP, being the governor of a state, managing a state with, with 2 different political parties as lead, and now finally becoming, occupying the highest seat in our democratic setup. So I think it's far more, the impact is far more inspirational than at this point in time for anybody, any child, any girl in a small city, in a small village, watching the visuals of a lady who lost her husband, who lost both her sons. Look at the fortitude of that woman to be here at this point in time. I think it's far more inspirational message than I would say, and that is the context we should look at it in my humble opinion.
Okay, indeed, a lot of personal struggle out there as well, and an inspirational message as you're pointing out, social, underlying social message as well, and social implications also. But looking at the process, we're also joined by Rohan Dua here. Rohan, welcome to Sunset Television, executive editor of the New Indian. Rohan, let's talk about the process, the electoral process as well, and that brings out a lot of elements in terms of the choice of candidate by the ruling dispensation. That one view is that seems to have, brought a foreclosure to the election even before it began in terms of the choice of candidate. That's one. Second is, during the entire process, it looked like the opposition perhaps came up as a divided house, and perhaps lack of strategic moves as well there. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And look at Vishal, I mean, the fact today is that whatever we may say that there was a joint opposition candidate or there was a divided house, but Yashwant Sinha did not cut the ice with the masses. Many Congress MLAs defected in terms of when they cross-voted against him, which showed the anger, which showed the frustration with the selection of this gentleman. Many people also had reservations about his character. There were a lot of expletives and abuses which came up in the social media from his past tweets and the statements and the remarks which he had made in the public at large. That also shows the kind of formidable character which Draupadi Murmu was emerging as, someone coming from a very humble background, a very modest background. Let's not forget the fact today that Prime Minister Modi is very fastidious, is very careful with his selection of some of these people, whether he selects Sonowal from Assam, brings him back the tribal areas, whether he brings Kiran Rijiju, whether he brings people from Tripura into his cabinet. He is very particular about picking up the communities which were not getting reflected in the parliament before. And for someone of Draupadi's Murmu's stature to handpick her and then drive a wedge between the opposition parties, so much that today, when Trinamool Congress was also holding a meeting on Vice President, there was no unanimity, there was no consensus of being built over who will be their VP candidate. So, politically, I would say there is an acumen involved as well. Like you said, it was almost given the fact that she was going to win by a landslide victory. And the way the build-up was made, the momentum was shifted in her favor. Many people, I just randomly, before coming to the studio, I met ex-Haryana CM Bhupendra Hooda, who told me in an exclusive 5-minute chat that, that it was almost given the kind of the character which Draupadi ji had begun to emerge as. For someone coming from Odisha, you can imagine, like he was also mentioning, the fact is that Odisha is a differently ruled political state. And Prime Minister has had actually a fair equation with the Odisha's Chief Minister as well. So he did not have sort of a problem there. And let's not also forget the fact today that when he went to Jharkhand, Prime Minister, to inaugurate the projects there, very next morning, the Jharkhand's Chief Minister, Hemant Soren, came up with a very forthright statement and steadfast support for Ms. Draupadi Murmu. So that shows the kind of planning which also went into her selection and then her election as well. Hemant Soren very openly came up in her support. It's not very often that you would see it divided. Now it's a Congress-ruled state.
Indeed. There are partners in the government out there. But that also brings in discussion one more aspect. And would you agree with this being pointed out by several analysts that perhaps the opposition camp could have made some more intelligent or important strategic moves in terms of the choice of candidate one and the timing of announcing the candidate. That would have been, would that have made a bit of a difference?
I think that would have, but let's not discount the fact today that opposition was a divided house even till 2019 and after 2019 as well. Whether you look at the West Bengal elections, Congress and TMC fought separately, and they did so even in Kerala. So opposition still remains a divided house. I mean, what happened in 2019 between BSP and SP is for everyone to know.
So the game of one-upmanship in the opposition camp still continues?
Absolutely. It was almost given that, that there was no consensus. It was just probably a perfunctory duty for them to put up a united candidate. But otherwise, Yashwant Sinha did not have any face overall in India.
Yatish, your views on that quickly?
You know, for a losing candidate, a lot can be said, but I would like to actually focus on the winning candidate more.
No, we're talking about the strategic, issues here,
Even
because
the strategic-
ultimately, this was all about political strategies from both camps.
Yeah, so I mean, if you were to dissect the political aspect of it, did Yashwant Sinha have a mass appeal? Well, matter of fact, Yashwant Sinha, has not had a mass appeal for a very long period of time. He is not a grassroots politician. He came from the bureaucratic setup, and he rode the initial wave, which brought him to a political ticket, basically. And subsequently, he is. If you look at his career over the last decade or so, he's not won an election. So to pitch him against somebody who has a fairly, who has a very clear identity as a tribal leader, and who has a very clear political mass and base in a state that is largely almost 18-20% tribal in nature, is itself a strategic mistake in that sense. But was that strategic mistake happening because they didn't have a choice? Because ultimately they chose a candidate who was a former BJP minister. So
he was also not the first choice, Sharad Pawar.
So, I mean, the fact that they
refused, Farooq Abdullah refused, there were other names as well.
So the fact that maybe all of them refused because they didn't see a chance of winning, which itself shows that there is no depth, or there is no, there's no depth of leadership, even for putting up a candidate for a presidential election. Second, that the opposition at this particular stage is not confident of itself enough. And even its base leaders like Sharad Pawar are not confident enough to be, put their name forward as a candidate. So,
let's now shift focus back to the winning candidate, which you were referring to, and I'd like to bring in Professor Verma here. Professor Verma, what's your assessment in terms of the winning candidate here, the 15th President of India, soon to be announced officially, of course, Draupadi Murmu, and the winning margin is increasing with each passing round. But in terms of the social implications, in terms of the message which goes across to the masses, as Yatish was referring to.
Vishal, there are 2-3 things very, very important in this entire, outcome. If I correctly remember, she is very close to K.R. Narayanan's 9,56,000 votes and Kalam's 9,22,000 votes. And as the count, we do not have the exact figures right now. But what I can understand is that she is very close to the highest winning candidates, K.R. Narayanan and Kalam. So that shows that she was by and large a consensus candidate, notwithstanding a candidate by the put up by the opposition. That is one thing. And secondly, that by bringing in Murmu as the next president of the country, I see that the BJP and the NDA, they are trying to give a very clear message that they are trying to change the entire grammar of Indian politics. And that grammar of Indian politics is that the Indian politics, number one, is de-elitized. That means on the top positions, earlier there used to be people who came from the political background and from the elite background. Now there is suddenly, you see that on the top positions, there are people who are with a humble background, and maybe that many people may not have known their names actually. So that is one thing, and that sees that the politics is getting more and more inclusive. That is one thing. The second thing which is very important is that the entire country seems to be shifting from identity politics to a kind of an inclusive politics. And today, every Indian somehow is feeling involved in the entire political process. And when you put up people from humble background at the top positions, then there is a message good in the society that democracy and the top positions in the democracy, they are also meant for them. So I see that these two things are happening. One is the entire grammar of Indian politics is changing, and the second is that the politics is becoming more and more inclusive, and less it is focusing on the identity politics. And the very fact that Murmu happens to combine so many things, being a woman, being a tribal, coming from a humble background, and so on and so forth, that makes the entire choice of the next president of India something very interesting. And notwithstanding the reservation shown by many people that they are fighting for democracy, and the opposition candidate also all time the harping that if he is elected, democracy is going to be defended and all. I don't clearly agree with all these arguments. And the ways that Murmu has been elected by cross voting from so many states and so many political parties, that shows that by and large she is going to win with a thumping majority, though we do not have the final figures as yet.
Okay, indeed, that looks like to be the final
Vishal.
conclusion there, as Professor Verma is referring to. Rohan, notwithstanding the fact that the President of India is a constitutional post with, of course, defined role and defined set of powers as well, but with somebody like Draupadi Murmu in Raisina Hill, the first citizen of the country, what do you think would be the issues which will get the benefit of her being there? And from her perspective, we have to understand the kind of message or the kind of issues which might come to the center stage vis-a-vis the policy makers, be it at the center or even at state governments.
You see, Vishal, I mean, over the last 5 years or so, if you see NDA government strategy in handling the internal security of this country, that has been paramount. The way they brought and tabled the Article 370 and then also sort of tabled the bill to ensure that J&K was going to be unitary, irrespective of the fact whether they go on to hold the elections there or not. The fact which is paramount is that there will be many appeals for clemency before the president as well, especially from the state of Punjab. Whether you look at the pro-Khalistani terrorists, the stand which Draupadi Murmu takes on subjects like this, where there's an involvement of internal security, because Punjab has recently witnessed a lot of killings and assassinations over the past 5 or 6 months. Yesterday also there was a shootout. These issues, I believe personally, will be very important for her to deal with. I remember when even UPA had sent a woman president, Pratibha
Patil.
So there were a lot of clemency appeals, and she was seen as a very soft president at that time. Someone who dealt with those issues not with an iron hand. Many clemency appeals were being either accepted or were being looked after. There were, of course, many assents which were needed for even the hanging as well. I do not want to name particularly those people, but they were involved in terror crimes, and those surprisingly those appeals were sent to the president. Now, when you have an NDA government at the center, where their joint candidate, despite the fact that it's a constitutional post, but when you have such sentiments, popular sentiments rising in the country, where the president's nod is needed in such cases, I believe that Draupadi Murmu will not get afraid. She looks to be a very intrepid woman at the moment, and she is definitely going to take stands which will be unwavering, which will be steadfast in support of the country's security.
Okay.
So that I believe is going to be the focus.
Okay. I'll come to you, Yatish, but let me bring in Professor Verma here, because Professor Verma, you made a point earlier in your first response about the message being of social inclusion. So when we're talking about what lies ahead as far as the 15th president of the country in Draupadi Murmu is concerned, do you think that there will be a renewed focus on issues specifically related to tribals?
You see, the President of India cannot be restricted to a particular issue or a particular denomination from which she belongs.
Indeed,
That
not,
will
not,
be
not from
very-
her side,
that-
but I'm saying, in terms of the focus from the policymakers, now that we have a tribal women as the president of the country, so issues, of course, related to that particular section of the society may, have a renewed focus on that.
No, you will appreciate that the government has already separated the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes Commission. So that is one step already has been taken, because earlier every issue was clubbed with the Scheduled Caste and the Scheduled Tribes were always marginalized. Now we have a full-fledged commission for Scheduled Tribes also, and there are a lot of steps are being already taken for. And of course, that doesn't mean that more steps are not needed. There are certainly greater steps. But I would understand that the gamut of the presidential responsibilities and onus is so wide that it would be very, very unfair to restrict that the president coming would focus on one particular social denomination, and that would be not actually desirable also, because now she is the president of India. That is one thing. And the second thing is, which is very important, is that whosoever is the president is virtually in the parliamentary system of government, he or she is actually a mouthpiece of the government in the parliamentary system. If you have watched the presidential address to the joint session of the parliament, you would appreciate that all the presidential addresses are actually written by the government and spoken by the president. The same is happening in the states. Governor simply speaks the note that is prepared by the Council of Ministers and the Chief Minister. So virtually it is the policy responsibility of the government, and the president is not supposed to interfere in the policies of the government.
Indeed.
Of course, she can always advise, she can be a counselor, she can be a consultant, she can be a kind of a guardian. But ultimately, the responsibility of a policy pronouncement has to be that of the government, because the government happens to be accountable to the Lok Sabha.
Indeed.
That means the lower house of the parliament, and also to the wider section, that is the people. So it is not that by Murmu, bringing in Murmu, the government is going to focus only on the tribals. Of course, when she is
Indeed.
there, certainly the government will have more attention to the tribal issues. But
Okay.
there are a plethora of issues on which the government and the president must also focus.
Okay. Okay, indeed. Quick concluding comments from you, Yatish, on this aspect, before we wrap this up.
It's interesting. You should look at the person, and the person does make a difference in the way that they carry the office or the responsibilities of the office forward. And if you look at Murmu as a person, and if you look at her as a governor of Jharkhand, and if you look at how did she, how
Perform.
did she look at the bills
As a
that
governor,
were put
yeah.
her up to her. So there's a very interesting incident which happened around in November 2016, when there were two bills which were presented by the Jharkhand government. One was the the Chota Nagar Tenancy Act, and the other was the Santal Paragram Tenancy Act. Both these acts were actually made by the government to ease the transfer of land from the tribals for industrial use.
And that was a BJP-led government.
And that was a BJP-led government. Now, both these bills she sent back, saying that, please explain to me, how do these bills basically help or benefit the tribals in the state? And there's a telling statement which is now become very popular about what she said. She said, मेरी कलम से कोई इंसाफी ना इंसाफी नहीं होनी चाहिए. But I will not sign a bill which would create any injustice in the country. So,
Okay.
So that, I mean, even to the clemency point, the clemency point, you have to also look at her, that she has lost her husband, she lost her two sons. There is a far greater empathy in a woman of that nature who has suffered loss herself.
Indeed.
When she is looking at a clemency appeal. So she might, of course, follow the the approach that the government wants, particularly when it comes to national security. But there are other clemency requests also.
Indeed.
Which are not terrorist oriented or terrorist.
There are aspects, Yatish, you're right. It is a constitutional position, and there is.
But the person does make a difference.
It does make a difference. There are set defined, a role for the President of India, as Rohan was also referring to. But the personality of the person who is sitting in that chair do have a lot of impact there. Thank you so much, Yatish, Rohan as well, and Professor A.K. Verma also for sharing your views and inputs. We'll come back again with a different topic, but till then, keep watching Sunset Television. Thank you.